So welcome back to Acosta's Anatomy, and in this lecture a couple of topics that I'm going to discuss. So one is reflex physiology, and another is two-point discrimination, which relates to general sensation. Okay, so if you find this lecture helpful, make sure to like and subscribe. So the first topic that I'm going to discuss are some of the reflexes. So these are some of the reflexes that we're not going to actually complete in class, but I want to explain, what it is that we're testing and how you go about doing them. Okay, so for the first one that we're going to talk about is what's known as the corneal reflex. And so the reason that we are testing the corneal reflex is to check the brainstem, make sure that everything is functioning normally. And so the way that this test would work is if you have like a cotton swab or something, what you would do is you would touch the subject's eye, so at the cornea. And what do you think would be the normal response when you would try to do that? What would they do? They would just blink. I just think about someone when they first get prescribed contacts, right? They have difficulty putting their contacts in because they're not used to touching the cornea. Okay, so that's one of the first ones that we're testing. Okay, so that's for the cornea. So you also have the next one, which is the gag reflex. So the gag reflex is what's testing the glossopharyngeal. So that's cranial nerve 9. And so for the glossopharyngeal, the way you go about doing the gag reflex is you would get, for instance, like a popsicle stick, and then you touch the little dangly thing on the back of your throat. Yeah, which is what we know as the uvula. And so the uvula actually does have like a particular function. So it prevents food from getting into the nasal cavity whenever we eat, and it also has saliva secretions by the uvula. So that's how we go about testing for the gag reflex. So obviously for the response, right, they would gag and you would see that the roof of the mouth or the part of the tongue that comes up, right, some of the musculature there. Okay, so it's a motor response. Okay, so that's for the gag reflex testing glossopharyngeal. Okay, so the next one that we have is the pupillary reflex. So for the pupillary reflex, I have this here. So this is a little light. And so the subject will stand and then you cover their eye. And so you shine it into the pupil. And so a normal response is that whenever you shine the light, the pupil will constrict. It'll get smaller. So that's a normal response. And so the cranial nerve that we're testing there is the oculomotor. So we'll learn next week when we talk about vision, like the actual reflex arc, like what actually happens. But the first part, the sensory aspect, is stimulating the optic nerve, which synapses with the motor neuron. So that's the oculomotor, which then comes out and innervates the pupillary, the muscles that contract the pupillary. So that way it constricts. So that's for the pupillary reflex. Okay, so now we're going to move on to, so the first ones I mentioned, so cranial nerve reflex, so for the cornea, cranial nerve 5, trigeminal, for the gag is 9, autonomic reflex. So for the pupillary reflex, that's referring to the autonomic nervous system, so that's what I'm discussing there. So then now we're moving on to the somatic reflex, and so for the first one that we're going to do is the reflex arc. So let me tell you like how this happens. So you get your hammer and then you have your subject, right? You'll sit here on the table, and then the clinician, what you'll do is you'll palpate the patella, and then you also palpate the tibial tuberosity. So then you find where that tendon is, or the ligament that goes from here to here, and then you just give it a nice whack. So I have this knee model here, so I would just go like this, and then I would just give it a good whack. And so what you'll see is that if everything is functioning normally, the knee will go into extension, because the quads are what's contracting. And so the reason that the quads are contracting is because once you strike the patellar tendon, it excites some of those proprioceptors, because what proprioceptors do is they detect stretch in the muscle spindles. So that's what happens. So we're going to go into the details as far as like what's actually happening there with what I have on the board. So the first thing is the level that it's happening. So it's L2 through L4. So that's the particular region within the spinal cord. And so once I tap the patellar tendon, right, you activate the proprioceptors, it detects the stretch. And so this is what's representing the sensory neuron, or the afferent neuron, that comes back here. And then it synapses here. So there's two parts that are diverging from this axon. So this first one that comes out this way, it synapses with the motor neuron, which is here in green. So this is what's going to the quads. So the reason that the quads will contract is because this is an excitatory synapse. And so this is what's known as monosynaptic, because the sensory neuron is synapsing with the motor neuron, right? So there's only one synapse there, compared to the hamstrings, because we're exciting the quads, but we're inhibiting the hamstring, so that way it doesn't prevent the extension. And so that's what we know as a polysynaptic, because there's an inner neuron which is in between the sensory neuron and then from the motor neuron that's coming out that goes to the hamstrings. Okay, so that's for the somatic reflex, the reflex arc. One of the other somatic reflexes that we're going to do in class today, so let me write that. So some reflex arc, patellar tendon reflex, and then we also have the plantar reflex. So let me explain a little bit about the plantar reflex and what happens. So what I'll do is I'll use this part of the little hammer, and then I rub it against, I start at the heel, and then I work my way laterally, and then I go immediately to where the great toe is. And so I just go like this, and then to the top of the foot. And so what a normal response, what will happen is the toes will curl. So toe flexion. And then also the toes will become like closer, they'll get closer to each other in this way. Okay, so that's a normal thing that will happen. But if it's abnormal, the response is toes, they're going to extend. So toe extension, and then they're also going to go outwards. So whenever I strike the bottom of the foot, the plantar surface, the toes will go into extension, and then they'll go outwards like that. So what the clinical significance of this, of the plantar reflex, so if there's an abnormal sign, what this is known, it's known as the Babinski sign. So obviously in adults, this is not a good thing. And so what this can indicate is damage to the corticospinal tract. So this can indicate damage to the corticospinal tract, which is one of the descending tracts within the spinal cord. However, in babies, the Babinski sign is normal. And the reason that's the case is because the myelination process has not been complete at the spinal cord. So therefore, in babies, they'll elicit the Babinskis, where the toes will go into extension and then go outwards. Okay, so that's it for the somatic reflexes. So the last topic that I want to discuss is in regards to general sensation. And so the last test that we're going to do in the lab, so I need one of the 2-point discrimination ones. Yeah, that one right there, that's fine. Okay. So for the 2-point discrimination, let me explain how this is going to work. So what you'll do is you'll start with this protractor looking device here, and you'll start with the two of the points close to each other. So the subject, they'll close their eyes, and then you'll poke their hand, and you'll say, okay, is that 1 or 2 points? So what you'll find out is that for the fingertips, they can be really close to each other, and you can still detect 2 points right there, okay? But when you do it on the back, they can't detect that there's a change, whether that it's 2 points, until the distance of it is a lot further compared to at the finger. So roughly around here is what you typically see. Okay, I don't have like the specific numbers or anything, but that's like roughly what you'll see. And so why does that happen? Like, why is that the case? Well, what I have drawn here on the board, so this is something that we've already discussed, which was the somatosensory homunculus. And so it's specific to the particular regions of where it's at. So for instance, this is where the face is, it has big lips, and then you'll see that this is where the hand is. And you see the difference in the size between like the hand and then the foot and then like the torso. So what that's indicating is the density of the neurons that are found within the fingers, and then also compared to like what's on the back, like the trunk. So this is why whenever you do the 2-point discrimination test, they can be at a very short distance between each other, right? And you can still tell that it's 2 points because there's a high density of those receptors that are found at this particular region, okay? Compared to on the back, there's not as much, right? Because we use our hands, it's very important, right? For when we touch things, the manipulation of like grabbing objects and everything, we have to have a high density of these neurons to do these type of things, but also like for sensation, like touching things. And so what the 2-point discrimination test, what this relates to clinically is the dorsal columns. So we've already learned about fasciculus cuneatus and fasciculus gracilis. So this is something that we can check by using the 2-point discrimination. So once again, the fingers, they're going to have a higher density of neurons compared to at the back where there is a lower density of neurons. And so when we're doing this 2-point discrimination, some of the receptors that we're stimulating are found here on this model, which is what would be our Meissner's corpuscle. So this is fine touch, or also it's known as discriminative touch. Okay, so that's going to do it for this lecture. Are there any questions? Okay.